Good afternoon. My name's Samir and I'm a third year PhD student at the University of Warwick. And I would just like to start by saying thank you to the Children's History Society for inviting me to speak at the upcoming conference. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the other presentations, and hopefully having some really kind of engaging discussions as well. So I'm going to present my PhD work, which is on the Royal Albert Asylum in Lancaster between 1870 and 1919. So Michael S., a boy of 13, was the first child formally admitted to the Royal Albert on 14th of February 1870. Michael had arrived at the institution from his father's home, where he appeared to be, and I quote, carelessly treated. Described as being thin and not clean, he was, and I quote again, allowed to run about on his father's works. Being of a restless disposition, the attendant who received Michael noted how he also, and I quote, kicks occasionally when excited. The subject of idiocy, Michael's condition was attributed to fits at a week old. He remained at the institution for more than 3 years before passing away on Christmas Eve 1873. His death represented a relatively common experience for children and their families at the Royal Albert. Child mortality was high in Victorian Britain, especially in institutionalized settings of care. Some 50 years later, a 6-year-old girl named Rhoda Holm entered the Royal Albert. As she had, and I quote, never been to school, her demeanour was clumsy and childish. She was a poor walker, nervous temperament. The cause of her idiocy was unknown. As we shall see, children were often admitted to the institution without an appreciation or understanding of the causes of their condition. Rhoda remained at the Royal Albert for 8 years, eventually being discharged in June 1927. Many children like Michael and Rhoda experienced their formative years being raised, socialised and educated within the boundaries of the Royal Albert. By the turn of the 20th century, this institution was one of Britain's largest and most prominent settings of residential care for children deemed in some way to be mentally deficient. Now, I recognise that mental deficiency is an outdated term and may be offensive to some. It is also highly nebulous. I use it today as it was used rather elastically by medical practitioners and social commentators in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to refer to a spectrum of conditions of mental impairment, ranging from severe forms such as idiocy through to imbecility in lesser degrees like feeblemindedness. These conditions were regarded as a manifestation of an underlying pathology of the mind that affected an individual's intellectual capacity and moral functioning. They were also correlated with what were perceived to be physical defects. So my PhD looks at how the Royal Albert emerged as a place where experimental forms of specialist education were developed within a broader nexus of scientific and medical research under the guidance of its long-serving medical superintendent, Dr. George Shuttleworth, and he is that figure on the right-hand side, sitting rather grandly at the desk. So my PhD employs the idea of caring power, adopted from Foucault's conception of pastoral power and expanded by historians such as Annemiek van der and Francesca de Haan. It considers how humanitarian ideals and practices of medical and educational care interacted with nascent disciplines like child psychiatry to reconstruct what were perceived to be children's damaged physical bodies and improve their impaired mental states. Rather than focusing on these practices, however, in today's paper, I offer some broad reflections on the demographic and social composition of some of the children admitted to the Royal Albert between 1870 and 1919. For this research, I randomly selected every 5th child from the over 3,800 admissions to the institution, spanning over a period of 50 years. This method was employed to ensure I created a broad, stratified sample of 383 children, from which I could draw some tentative conclusions about the nature of the institution's population. The paper itself will be quite quantitative heavy, so I apologise in advance for this. Before I delve into these insights, I briefly talk about the Royal Albert's financial and administrative setup, highlighting its reach across the north of England. I then present my analysis using children's case files to illustrate a central theme that structured experiences of childhood at the institution. Because of time constraints, I can only talk today very briefly about patterns of medical diagnosis. I also touch in a limited way on educational themes and scientific research. In my thesis, I go into much more detail about how the Royal Albert sought to educate the children in its care, as well as exploring wider experiences of socialisation such as employment and children's involvement in the burgeoning criminal justice system. It is worth saying from the outset that in the limited time available, I cannot do justice to the depth and complexity of people's lived experience. The source material I rely on, namely medical case files, permit only a selective reconstruction of how medical actors perceived and treated children. I do not claim to grasp the realities of life at the Royal Albert from the viewpoint of children themselves. So as it was situated in Lancashire, just south of the city of Lancaster, most of the Royal Albert's young population came from regions in the north of England. Children were elected by a vote of the subscribers of the institution, whose regular donations entitled them to support certain candidates for admission. The asylum was organised in such a way that places for children were allocated proportionate to the amount of money donated by geographical regions. The big counties in northern England, such as Lancashire and Yorkshire, had the largest allocations. They remained by far the largest financial contributors to the institution and the regions from where most of the children were admitted between 1870 and 1919, as shown in Table 1. So the funds generated for the Royal Albert's maintenance account came predominantly from Lancashire and Yorkshire, which makes sense as these counties had major industrial and port cities. And as you can see, Lancashire and Yorkshire, over a period of about 40 years, had donated almost 10 times more than any other region to the Royal Albert's Maintenance Fund, which was used to maintain the institution. So in order to tap into the financial administrative support of local communities, the Royal Albert created several local associations and county committees in towns and cities. The 7 major counties in northern England each had a committee. Representatives from these were also appointed to the institution's central committee, which acted as an executive body invested with the power to discharge patients or commission the construction of new buildings. These were joined by many local organisations. In 1872, just 3 years after its foundation, 39 local branches existed, representing larger areas such as Burnley and smaller districts like the seaside town of Whitby. These branches were central to the functioning of the institution as they provided a steady stream of candidates for admission, as well as providing much needed financial support to the institution, especially in the early years of the Royal Albert's existence. Women's associations were also established across the north of England. Women were actively involved in promoting the work of the Royal Albert in their local areas, as well as selecting and evaluating candidates for admission. One of the largest of these ladies' associations, formed in the Bradford and Craven districts, generated over £7,500 in 31 years. And to put that in context, in Lancashire, in Yorkshire, in up to 1872, Yorkshire generated 32,000. So that's quite a considerable amount of funds being generated by one ladies' association. So the expansion of activities of local branches, county committees and women's associations suggests that the Royal Albert was more than just one organisation situated in a physically imposing building in Lancashire. It was outwardly a behemoth with its own school, farm, system of employment and railway station. But it was also a network of organisations that stretch across the north of England. Through smaller active branches and women's associations, the Royal Albert effectively mobilised local communities to fundraise its ambitious expansion, especially in the latter decades of the 19th century, by promoting its work and by listing and selecting new candidates for admission. And you can see on the slide examples of local committees. So you've got committees established in places like Blackburn and Bolton and Hartlepool and Huddersfield, and you've got ladies' associations also in Cheshire, Halifax, Manchester, Southport. So this was a truly kind of I was going to say global, but it was a truly national organisation across the north of England, in the sense that ladies' associations and local committees were created in so many different parts of the north. So it had a real footprint in these local communities. So let us turn now to the population of the Royal Albert. I've already mentioned how children were admitted predominantly from those counties that contributed financially most to the institution, namely Lancashire and Yorkshire, as illustrated in Table 2. More males than females were admitted. So before we go on to that, so in this slide you can see that basically over half of the admissions to the Royal Albert from 1870 to 1902 were from Lancashire, closely followed by Yorkshire. So yeah, more males than females were admitted. This differentiation based on gender has also been illuminated in other studies, including the multi-silent work by Stephen Taylor. Other historians, such as Anne Borsey, have tried to explain this difference by arguing that males, and I quote, were less useful within the family division of labour, where childcare was a marketable commodity. And David Wright also speculates that girls with mental deficiency could do basic domestic chores in their household and would therefore be less likely to be confined in institutions. And you can see clearly from 1870 to 1919, boys were admitted more frequently than females. So children came to the Royal Albert from a variety of socio-economic backgrounds. Discounting those families whose occupational backgrounds is unknown, the families of children accommodated at the institution represented a broad cross-section of Victorian and Edwardian society. Accessible to poor and rich alike, we find many from manufacturing trades. Find many relatives from manufacturing trades, making commodities like shoes, clothes, caps, and bottles. Others were involved in various ways in the cotton industry. We also see some relatives employed in services, whether in the commercial area like insurance or in government. The biggest cohort were general labourers. About 2/3 of children were private patients, with their fees paid for either by parent subscribers or other patrons. As the 19th century ended, an increasing number of pauperised children moved into the institution. Some were from pauper families, others were orphans. They were sent to the Royal Albert, first from workhouses across the north of England and later on the authority of newly formed local mental health committees. And you can see on the table on the left-hand side how throughout the period the number of pauper children increased quite substantially, and particularly in the years between 1910 and 1919. So the average age of girls admitted also appears to have increased between 1870 and 1919, from just under 10 to 14. For males, the average age appears more stable over time, but this stability masks great disparities. The youngest child admitted was Sybil T, who was 4 years old. Notwithstanding readmissions, the oldest person admitted was Mary R, who was 48 when she entered the institution in August of 1914. This range is also evident when looking at the average stay of children. Over 50% stayed between 0 and 7 years. This reflects the stated goal of the Royal Albert, which was to provide 7 years of training, although Shuttleworth argued that children should stay for at least 10 years. As shown in Table 7, many children remained at the institution for more than a decade, with some being confined for more than 30 years. This suggests that in the main, the Royal Albert was not necessarily, in the words of Andrew Skoll, a dumping ground for incurables and undesirables, and that's a quote, but it did institutionalize some individuals for very long periods of time. So you can see that the average duration of stay was between 4 and 7 years, but there were periods, for example, in 1880 to 1899, where children were admitted and stayed for up to 11 years. So what connects children at the Royal Albert was that they were all diagnosed with forms of mental deficiency. Table 8 shows that of the 383 children in my sample, the majority, around 75%, were thought to be imbeciles. Although feeble-mindedness emerged as a category of mental deficiency towards the end of the 19th century, medical practitioners who diagnosed children preferred to utilise more traditional medical divisions like imbecility and idiocy. Indeed, the preponderance of imbecility over idiocy seems to tally with the stated goal of the Royal Albert to work only with children who had the potential to improve. As imbecility was regarded as a less severe form of intellectual dysfunction, children who had the condition were viewed more favourably in terms of their potential to improve, and therefore I feel were more likely to be admitted. Breaking down the reported causes of mental deficiency also illustrates a sensitivity to the alleged role played by environmental factors in its causation. So Shuttleworth divided mental deficiency into two broad typologies, depending on whether it was regarded as a congenital or hereditary condition, or caused after birth by some accidental or environmental factor or factors. Although hereditary ideas were ascribed as causes, what is striking is the degree of social influences. A plethora of seemingly incidental factors were considered causes, especially if these affected maternal health during pregnancy. So these included maternal anxiety and shocks caused by the deaths of relatives or boating accidents, as well as instrumental deliveries and sunburn, vaccinations and illnesses like scarlet fever. And you can see in this table that the biggest kind of cause or ascribed cause of mental deficiency was related to maternal health. So it shows the kind of importance of the female body and the mother's health to whether children develop mental deficiency, at least from the perspective of medical practitioners at the Royal Albert. Nonetheless, medical diagnosis at the Royal Albert appears to have been an imprecise science. In their study of the admission of pauper children to the Devon County Asylum between 1845 and 1914, Joseph Melling et al. Point to the, and I quote, subjective and impressionistic practices which informed medical diagnosis. This was no different at the Royal Albert, a point underlined by the fact that approximately half of all cases had no assigned cause. More broadly, most children received a combination of conventional medicine to treat common ailments like tuberculosis. Epilepsy was also common, despite the Royal Albert expressly denying entry to children whose families had a history of the condition. Indeed, the institution's case files are replete with descriptions of children having seizures, and many perished because of the illness. And you can see in this table that convulsions, fits, and epilepsy were assigned as a cause of mental deficiency in 46 children. And bearing in mind that this is only a sample of 383, you can times that by about 5 or 6 to get kind of a true estimate of how many children had epilepsy at the institution. So many children also received a more specialized form of physical therapy called physiological education to improve their physical abilities. Shuttleworth developed an elaborate program of educational strategies that emphasized children's sensory training to build their intellectual capacity and thus moral sensibilities. The progress of some children was also monitored for their potential benefits for scientific and medical research. Frederick P's condition was closely followed by Shuttleworth, who referred to his case in a scientific paper. Mary X was also the subject of another investigation, which appeared in the Journal of Mental Science in 1874. And Sarah W.'s brain was preserved and used as a basis for an investigation into the cerebral structures of children with mental deficiency. And you can see Sarah's brain here on the left-hand side, that was preserved. This is in the collection, George Shuttleworth's private collection of scientific kind of artifacts, as it were, in the held at Wellcome Trust. And this was used directly in his research in his book, Mentally Deficient Children, Their Treatment and Training, which was published in 5 editions in the late 19th and early 20th century. So it's evident that some young people were routinely subject to medical examination and scientific study. Many were subject to post-mortems conducted by Shuttleworth in order to understand the somatic basis of mental disease. And I provided some stats as to the frequency of post-mortem dissection at the Royal Albert. So basically between 1871 and 1890, of the total recorded number of deaths, which was 257, 76 children were kind of dissected, and that's around 30%. And many children were under 15 years old. I think so. The youngest was probably 8 years old. So to conclude, I briefly presented some demographic and social characteristics of children who were institutionalized at the Royal Albert between 1817 and 1919. The institution was open to children from a variety of backgrounds. Many were private patients, but an increasing number were pauperized children from local communities in the north of England. More boys than girls were admitted, and the average age of those who entered the Royal Albert increased more for the latter than the former. I've also noted how more children were regarded as having imbecility and have suggested some reasons for this. In keeping with other studies of asylums, medical diagnosis appears to have been an imprecise and inconsistent practice. Maternal health was seen as an especially important factor in the genesis of mental deficiency. Lastly, I have highlighted how some children were the subject of targeted medical interventions and scientific study, especially through post-mortem examination. So thank you for listening, and I will gladly take any questions.